Alright, so I wanted to talk to you guys about some settings for glass, as well as just sort of like general sampling reduction stuff. I might break it down into 2 videos, but anywho. So I have this head, and this is just with all the default render settings and all that good stuff. I've just applied a default glass shader to this, and you can see there's a few things kind of weird about it. One, looks a little weird at the base here. I think it might be clipping through the bed, but the shadow is very clearly not reflecting what the rest of this head is doing. So the first thing that you need to do if you guys are doing glass stuff is select the object itself, go into the shape node under the Arnold tab, and just check off opaque. What that should do, and I'll just turn this on to progressive refinement, and hopefully, so I've been told my videos lag pretty badly, so I'm going to try to not do a lot of like demo stuff while this is rendering. So I'll just sort of like click it, let it go, and then like pause it, and hopefully that'll help. Still working on that. But anywho, so you can see that now we have this lovely little blue highlight here, and it's still just taking a while to render. It's like such is the nature of glass. I'm gonna stop this really quick. There's another setting that will make your stuff look significantly nicer if you turn it on. It will turn up rendering, or make your renders take longer, but it's like really worth it in the end, especially if your glass stuff is supposed to have interesting reflections or is like a foreground object. And that is going into the shader itself. Scroll down under the Advanced tab and turn on Caustics. Caustics, so focus mostly on the area like down here and in the base of this thing. What Caustics does is it's basically like those cool little reflections that you see in the base of glass, like where it'll sort of like twist and make like all these interesting little highlights. That's what Caustics is, and this is a kind of weird example of it, but you can see it's adding like a little bit of sort of extra highlight and visual interest into that shadow. Certain shapes bring it out more than others, but I do think it looks nice when you turn it on. So that's just my bit on sort of glass settings. Excuse me. In the interest of not murdering my computer, I am going to turn this off for most of my render, and just sort of look at the settings that generally affect glass. So there's a few different ways that you can mess with the sampling. Like a lot of times, you know, you'll make a scene and it looks pretty nice. You'll be rendering something and then you'll be like, ooh, why is it everything shiny in my scene looks really weird? And there's like a bunch of samples on it, or like why is all my glass stuff really samply but like nothing else is? So there's I guess different render or sampling types when you're adjusting sampling. There's sampling on a per light basis, basically, which is a setting in the light itself. And then there is sort of world settings for your sampling. And in this case, kind of irritatingly, this is actually not terrible looking of a render. I'm going to stop this though because it's been going for a hot minute. But you can see, I mean, if we look in this, there's like a little bit of sampling like right in here. So I am going to scroll in just aggressively on this area. We're just going to render this piece of the head repeatedly. It's going to be great. So per light, lighting, as I mentioned, is if you go into the like your sky dome light and you're like, cool, here is samples. That's going to be, you know, what you want to look at for the lighting itself, for a single light. Like if you notice you have some little accent lights, they're not really doing anything, you probably don't need to do a lot of sampling. But if it's like the main light in your scene that's causing issues, or you notice everything there's a light pointed at specific stuff in your scene that's casting shadows, and all the shadows from that light are samply, instead of adjusting global settings and making all your light samples more, what you can do is just go into that light and be like, boop, and turn this up, and that'll usually help. So that's the sort of preferred way to do things, if you can, is adjust things on a per light basis, because that way you can increase render quality without doing unnecessary calculations for the computer. In this case, what we're going to do is go into the render settings, and under the Arnold Renderer tab, and Redshift has a similar thing, there's all of these options here, and these are all global sampling things. So if you change something here, it's going to change it for everything. If you add more diffuse settings, it's going to do that for all of your lights, and that would just be stuff like this Lambert background or like the shadows in the background, that kind of thing. Specular is going to be for shiny areas, so if you have, you know, metal or chrome or something shiny that is kind of universally samply only on the shiny parts, you could mess with that. Transmission is what we're going to look at here for this glass bit. So right now the samples are set to, what are these, 2? I'm just going to do something really insane and see what happens if I set this up to like 6. It's probably going to look way nicer. It's also going to take way longer to render. And sometimes it's kind of just not avoidable. Like if you want your stuff to not be sampley, you kind of just need to suck it up and set the settings higher, even if it is painful and makes your renders take forever. And in this case, glass is always one of those things that takes a long time to render. Especially if you're doing something really weird shaped like this and you have like caustics and all that stuff turned on, it's just like, eek. But you can see now that it's finally starting to render again, that it is a little bit smoother in here, and this, compared to what it was up here, you can see this is like significantly nicer looking. It's apparently 282% done. So it took 40 seconds to render this tiny patch of glass, but look how nice this looks compared to this. It's still kind of sampley in here, but like, gross, hideous glass, nice, smooth glass. So that's the samplings you want to mess with for that. And again, that's just like on a per sort of texture basis. So what you can also do is just look at this. I messed up my nice pretty render. If we're just looking at the sort of shadow under here, the difference again between bumping up, I'm going to put this back down, I'm going to put this down to 1 and see what it does. But you could bump up the samples universally to like 6. And I do recommend going in smaller increments when you do this. It is pretty overkill to go straight to 6. Normally you'd only need to go to like 3, 4, especially if you're using per light sampling, but you can see that looks much, much nicer. So sometimes it is kind of worth just sort of going up like higher than you think you need and then sort of taking it back down, but usually I work the other way because it's just kind of easier. So in this case, I'm going to go through and see what happens if I mess with the settings. Which light is this? This is not my scene. I poached this from a student, and I do not remember where any of the lights are. So in this case, you'll notice that like I set the samples here to 3, and that looks dramatically better than what it was previously at 1, and it took less time to render. And the reason that that is happening is because the Sky Dome light, we're adjusting 1 light. So I think right now there's like 3 or 4 lights in the scene. By only adjusting this 1 light, it saves the other, 3 or 4 lights doing a bunch of extra sample calculations. So if we bump this up to 6, it's going to render way faster, and it also happens to look nicer than when we set the global sampling to, and it's even at 5, than we set the global sampling to 6. So basically the moral of this story is render smarter, not harder. Don't just go into your render settings and like jack all the settings up to, 30. It'll make your renders take forever, and it might not actually fix whatever the issue is, which would always kind of suck.